So, Chris, please just tell us what the mood was like at Party Conference. What were you picking up?
It was an interesting conference for a number of reasons, really. It was the first since Nicola Sturgeon stood down as First Minister. It was also really the first since the dip in the SNP's fortunes. And I guess both of those things, along with all the other troubles the SNP have had over the past year, were pretty evident in the mood around the place. So certainly for the last decade or so, SNP conference has been a bit of a buzzy place. There's been a lot of business activity on the stalls, a lot of lobbyists around, many members, thousands of people in attendance, obviously on the view that independence was just around the corner. So it felt like the most exciting political event in Scotland. And I'd say this year it didn't feel like that anymore. Maybe that's not a huge surprise given everything we've seen. But it was notable that there was a lack of buzz, that there were fewer people from business there. There were fewer business people in stalls. I think maybe seen some of the photographs on social media that Humza Yousaf's speech wasn't full. The audience wasn't full when that happened. So I guess, as I say, what would you expect after a very difficult year for the SNP? The conference reflected that throughout, really.
Yeah, and a very difficult time as well, because it was coming off the back of that big defeat in the Rutherglen by-election. And then you had the defection of Lisa Cameron as well to the Conservatives. So not an easy political environment for Humza Yousaf to have his first conference as leader in.
That's right, and not one the SNP have grown used to. They tend, they've been on the up for so long that everything has been sort of lollipops and lemonade for them, and suddenly it doesn't feel like that. I think, the speeches from ministers were a bit ho-hum in my view, and I suppose the main highlight of the event, which didn't really help, was the arrival of Nicola Sturgeon, who came swooping down like some, former grandee, and everyone was delighted to see her, and she got a huge round of applause during Humza's speech, also when she arrived at the conference itself, and perhaps that just showed us what the SNP are missing now, just that element of stardust, whatever the personal difficulties that Nicola Sturgeon is still dealing with around the investigation into party finances. But nevertheless, the contrast between Nicola Sturgeon and just that edge of, or a reminder of better times when the SNP government and cabinet as it is now was quite stark.
I was just going to say that the sort of headlines that I noticed come out of it were the council tax freeze and the new strategy on independence, which I think we were going to come on to discuss, which is moving from 50% of the popular vote to now 50% of the seats. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Finally, we got some clarity, because we'd been having this discussion for some time. It wasn't at all evident what the SNP policy actually was. And in fact, when I interviewed Humza Yousaf for the New Statesman the week before the conference, I kind of asked him, do you know what your policy is? Because everything I'd heard from him, it wasn't clear that he did. And he spoke for some time, and I was every bit as confused at the end of his explanation than I was at the start. But we've got where they wanted to get to, which is a policy which is, if the SNP wins a majority of Scottish seats, the 59 Scottish seats at the next general election, they will take that as a mandate to begin discussions with the British government, not, I think, about moving towards independence or immediately moving to independence, but more about what the route is to a second referendum. I think that's what they're talking about. And I mean, I think the fact they've reduced it to a majority of seats says something about their expectations for the next general election, because Sturgeon's policy was 50+1% of the vote in Scotland, which is obviously a much higher bar than half of 59 seats. So that tells us maybe that they've had to scale down their ambitions a bit. And they are still saying to people, even if we lose a bunch of seats, because they've got much more than what they're aiming for at the moment, even if we lose a bunch of seats, we still think we're in a position to have a mandate to begin these conversations. And I just wonder how that would feel in the cold light of day, because it would be seen in general in the country, if that was what they achieved in the general election, that momentum had stopped for them, that they'd kind of lost the general election, even if they're a bit ahead. If they lose a bunch of seats, it's not going to feel like a victory for them. So to then claim, well, that's a mandate, I think will feel quite hollow when it gets there. And in a way, I think it's really a holding position. They know they're not going to get a referendum anytime soon. They know that the polls are dipping in terms of support for the party. And I just think they needed a position to keep going basically. So this is what they've got, and it also allows us, as Yusuf said in the interview, he wanted to make the choice about what the policy was. Conference decides, the party decides, and then we move on to focusing on all of the issues that the people in Scotland are talking about, like the people across the UK in terms of cost of living and the state of the economy and whether public services are operating the way they should. This allows him to do that. I think we can debate whether it's the right policy on independence, but nevertheless, and maybe we saw this in his speech, if we want to talk about that, he was quite keen in his speech to move on from banging on about independence as well. So that was a bit of a sign of what we're going to get over the next year in the run-up to the general election.
How's the council tax policy gone down with Scottish voters?
I'm not sure about Scottish voters. I haven't seen any evidence of that yet. Fair to say, it hasn't gone down well with Scottish councils. Who weren't told in advance that this was going to be announced, and in fact the Scottish Cabinet wasn't told it was going to be announced, or certainly didn't get the chance to agree to it before it was announced. It was a real surprise, actually, because the SNP, under some pressure from think tanks like Mind Reform Scotland, we've been saying for ages that the centralisation of power at Holyrood has really left Scotland's councils neutered. They've got very little control over what they're able to do economically, and we've had a council tax freeze before in Scotland under the SNP, I think around about 2017, and we know that councils are struggling under existing budgets. Services are being cut. They've had real funding problems in terms of what's being delivered from central government over the last decade or so, and now with no consultation they've been told that it's going to be frozen again, and the backlash has been really interesting. COSLA, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, is basically threatening to rebel and said, you can't make us, which is it's quite entertaining. Of course, the government can't really make them in terms of ordering them to do it, but it does have various levers it can pull to ensure that, if you don't do this, then we will cut your funding or whatever. There are ways to use the bully pulpit of high office, if you like, to achieve this. I think Humza Yousaf is aware that by putting up income tax, they're moving towards the edge, I think, of what the public are willing to tolerate, that sort of sense of middle Scotland, who are also having it very hard under the cost of living crisis. I think people have been willing to see taxes rise a little bit to help fund some poverty programmes, but people in middle Scotland are a bit skint as well. So I certainly, from probably more anecdotally than anything else, I'm hearing that people are kind of had enough of it and a bit worried about their own pockets. So I think in a way Humza's gambling here that by forcing councils to keep tax down, he can sell that as a tax cut. And come the budget, which is on December the 19th, the Scottish budget, he might therefore be able to put income tax up a bit more and claim that that's a progressive move because he's saving people money on the council tax. But again, there's arguments about what's progressive and what's regressive in both of those things. So there's going to be an ongoing Barney about that, which we shall be covering closely. It
strikes me as a political opportunity for Scottish Labour that, Gordon Brown talking about his Constitution Commission and how there is power kind of hoarded in Holyrood. This is kind of going to be an example of all the things that Gordon Brown's arguing for, I think. There's
a number of things there as well. So, the Tories in Scotland have been talking about cutting taxes back to UK levels, because at the moment our income tax, if you earn over £20,000 a year, you'll pay more in income tax than you would if you were elsewhere in the UK. The Tories have said they want to reduce taxes back to UK levels, and the SNP have obviously raised them and are making it pretty clear they want to raise them further. And Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, has come in and said, we're not going to put them up anymore. So he's kind of having his cake and eating it a bit, splitting the difference. Yeah. So, that's a bit of positioning there. And as you say, Gordon Brown and others have been arguing that we need a wee bit of loosening from the centre in Scotland. It's certainly the case that since the Scottish Parliament came along, it's really not only, so power's been devolved from Holyrood, but Holyrood itself has really pulled power towards itself from local authorities. And there's been a lot of talk at the Parliament, on parliamentary committees, I think, and in Civic Scotland, that needs to change. Councils as well, not just Labour councils or whatever, but SNP councils. Glasgow City Council, the biggest in Scotland, which is run by the SNP, they want a loosening of control from the centre so that they can tackle many of the problems that Glasgow has. So, it's a debate that hasn't gone away, and I think that was because of the direction it had been moving, and that was why the council tax freeze was such a surprise when it was announced.
Yeah, and where are all these changes of strategy coming from? Is it that Labour is sort of riding higher in the polls and, had that success in the by-election? Because a lot of their rhetoric was the SNP is a high tax party, they're obsessed with independence. And so they've moved away from that de facto referendum position, and also they've moved, to try and make themselves perceived as a bit less of a high taxing party. Is this pressure from Labour that's changing the strategy? Do you think it's Humza Yousaf's true instincts? You've interviewed him, so maybe you could tell.
I think the Labour relative success is definitely a part of it. You could see that, and in polls as well, you could see that independence was slipping down the list of priorities, even amongst pro-independence supporters. Not surprising, given what we've been living through for the past few years, and that the SNP are dropping in the polls. So I think Humza Yousaf and his team obviously noticed that. They're not daft, and they knew that the debate over the process of getting towards independence had gone on and on, really, since Sturgeon brought her de facto referendum, perhaps before that, with the various demands for referendums themselves, and realised that the public were getting a bit tired of the discussion, and were worried about the NHS and schools and jobs and their income. So, as I said earlier, the idea was to get through conference, take a position on independence, and then move on to those priorities. And it was interesting during his speech that it was quite policy rich in places. He's no Winston Churchill in terms of oratory, but actually I found it quite an interesting speech because, well, the arguments and discussions about independence were really in the second half of the speech, and you wouldn't really expect that. You'd expect it to be up top. There was a brief mention at the start, but then he got onto various announcements. So funding various projects. He wants to anchor a new offshore wind supply chain, maybe 500 million in funding over 5 years for that. There'll be a pilot scheme for domestic abuse survivors who, when they leave their partners, will be given £1,000 as part of a fund to leave. And also interesting, and again, maybe this speaks to some of the sort of pro-independence canniness, there's going to be an extra 100 million in each of the next 3 years to cut NH waiting lists, but also the funding of the arts is going to be doubled over 5 years. And you might remember back at the time of the independence referendum, the National Collective, which was a kind of organisation set up by the artistic community in favour of independence, was really important. It kept the profile high. It brought in a lot of well-known celebrity Scots or creative Scots, and made independence cool. So there'd been a lot of talk about cuts to arts and, a lot of disenchantment in the artistic sector about the direction the government was moving. And so it's hard not to see, doubling over 5 years funding for the arts as a bit of stay with us, guys. Times are hard, but we will basically stuff your mouths with gold if you'll stick with us. But that said, the other thing it's worth mentioning, of course, is they announced plans for Scotland's first ever bond. There's going to be a bond put on the financial markets to fund various social programmes in Scotland. And again, that speaks a bit to the longer term independence programme, because the argument has always been that an independent Scotland might struggle, certainly in relation to the way the UK operates, to fund its money on the international markets. There wouldn't be the market confidence. So this, in a way, is a bit of a free hit to try that. We'll see what we get. We'll see what the rates that are charged are. Obviously, there'd be an implicit guarantee from the UK because we're still part of the UK, so it wouldn't be a true test. But I think they want to establish the principle that Scotland could float a bond, and once that's done, they can do it again. So it's looking a bit to the future and to those arguments for whether Scotland would, what the economics of an independent Scotland would look like.
It's really interesting. I wonder how that's gone down with their partners in government, the Greens, and how that relationship is shaping up in general. I mean, was there disquiet about that relationship at the conference? It
depends who you speak to. So again, when I interviewed Humza Yousaf, I did ask him about the Greens, and this was on the back of some of the comments that were made about Hamas by some of the Greens, who are, tend to find that many of them are very pro-Palestinian and very distrustful of the Israeli government, and it created some awkward questions. But I did ask him whether he felt that the Green coalition that they've set up would run through to 2026, which he said before he's very happy with, and he wants to keep it running, gives them a majority at Holyrood to get the legislation through. There's a lot of people in the SNP who are becoming less happy with that, because some of the policies that have been troublesome for the SNP have been really green-derived or green-driven policies, an attempt to work with the Greens on certain quite hardline environmental policies. But he did say that the coalition is kept under review constantly. He would be keeping it under review, but for the moment he was happy with it. It was a slightly more lukewarm statement than I was used to hearing from him, but that might just have been, speaking to the audience that he was saying what he thought I would probably want to hear. But actually the Greens have been pretty quiet I think they're aware as well that the SNP are struggling at the moment, and the SNP do badly, then the Greens will go out of government. The case for independence, which they're at least as passionate about as the SNP, will be set back. So I think they're maybe sucking it up a bit at the moment, just to try and get the things turned around.
And actually, what we should discuss lastly is that Humza Yousaf has had a really difficult time personally in the past few days. His in-laws are trapped in Gaza, and he's spoken quite movingly about it. And I think, and you can tell us more about this, Chris, but I think he's perceived to have trod quite a good line on the Israel-Hamas crisis so far, given that he has such a personal stake in it. I mean, he was seen embracing one of the bereaved at a synagogue, which was quite a moving moment. Tell us more about how he's responded to the crisis.
I think he's been quite statesmanlike, and setting aside these awful personal circumstances, and we all feel for him as we do for the relatives of everyone caught up in this situation, both in Israel and in Gaza. I think in a way, politically, and it sounds a bit trite to say it, but I still think it's true, it's given him a chance to be statesmanlike, because he's been able to, in a sense, rise above the prejudices on one side or the other. The fact that he's been to synagogues, he's been to mosques, he's been able to talk about it from a position of personal difficulty, but actually be, in a sense, the bigger man, and talk to, on behalf of Scotland's Jews, as well as the Arab community and others. So I think he's handled it really well, and it is one of those moments where you wonder if it'll be the making of him slightly, because he's had to sort of step up and grow a little bit and speak for the country rather than for the SNP, for both sides. And I think he's handled it really well so far. Obviously, it's his wife Nadia's parents who are stuck in Gaza. They were over visiting family, and I know, again, when I spoke to him, he was worried about the amount of food and water they had. They only had enough for a few days. There's a 4-month-old baby in the family who relied on formula milk, so they're worried about access to these kind of things. Then obviously they worry about the military response from Israel. So they must be going through a lot as a family at the moment, and we've seen, I think, Nadia has been on the television talking about it. We've seen video clips from her mother from Gaza, and it looks very, very fraught. And I know that Humza Yousaf's been speaking to the Foreign Office, trying to ask about some route out of Gaza, and whether a ceasefire would be possible. Obviously, from his family position, that would suit him best. But overall, I do think he's balanced things well. I think he's won the respect of people in the way that he's handled this very difficult situation.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.